2025 is set to be a year of change for holidaymakers and business travellers. A big shake-up is underway, affecting millions of trips as international regulations change. There'll be new requirements for passengers to have a new generation of digital permits involving fees and application processes. If you're planning a trip, here is what you need to know. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Faye Barker, and joining me now is our consumer editor, Choi, and ITV News producer, Daniel Boal, who have been investigating these large-scale changes. Welcome to you both. So, Chris, give us an overview of what these changes are.
You've already said some key things there that will have stabbed right at the heart of some holidaymakers, because once you start talking about complexity and additional requirements, that's going to worry people. I can't be the only person that has this recurrent nightmare that you've forgotten your passport when you end up at the airport. This is now going to be like that on stilts. It is massive. I'll give you some numbers, shall I? I know you like numbers on this podcast. The changes that we're going to be talking about in the next few minutes actually will affect 1.4 billion people in 60 countries. 30 European countries are changing their rules, some EU, some not EU. They'll affect more than 60 million trips. And as you've already hinted, there'll be whole new complexity. There'll be an extra level of planning your holiday and your trips. I mean, everybody at this time of year is thinking about, oh gosh, when will my next break be?
Yeah, that January feeling.
Oh, let's have a bit of sunshine, for goodness sake. And that's the relaxing bit of travel. But we all know it comes with stress, especially if you've got kids or perhaps you're caring for older people. There can be levels and levels. And if now you are talking about all of this that's coming down the pipeline, these extra requirements, extra stress is certainly going to be there when it comes to planning trips.
So what tips would you have, important ones, especially for anyone who is now planning a trip to Europe, for example?
Right, well, this is the big one. This is called the ETIAS, and it is going to be a requirement. It's kind of a digital permit to travel into Europe. It's a big, big change when you consider just how many people each year holiday in Europe. We're talking about Spain and France and Portugal, where we all go in our droves. So you're going to need this thing called an ETIAS, which stands for, and I'll be testing you later, the European Travel Information and Authorisation System, a digital travel permit, in other words. And the first issue is, when are you going to need it? And the answer to that is, nobody knows. You might say that's a typical EU thing, isn't it? They were talking about introducing it back in November. It was delayed. It's been delayed again. We know it's likely to come in the second half of 2025, and all the travel agents I've spoken to are saying it will be after the summer peak. Doesn't mean that you can just push it into the back of your mind, because obviously winter travel is now a very big market for UK customers, particularly Christmas. So it's possible it will affect you this year. Even more likely, it will affect you in 2026. And what it means, you're going to have to apply for this thing. You'll probably be able to do it via an app. We don't know all the details yet, or on a website. It's quite a convoluted process. I've had a look at the questions you've got to answer. It's not only the stuff you'd expect to get from your passport. They're asking about whether you've had any kind of a previous conviction, for example, what your educational status is, things like that, quite nosy Parker type stuff. And that reveals that it is partly for security, partly for efficiency, because going digital makes things quicker, in theory, but also security. So there will be some questions that you have to answer. Anybody travelling into those 30 countries in Europe will need an ETIAS.
To me, it sounds a little bit like the ESTA.
It's very much like the ESTA.
For the United States.
Absolutely, very similar. For people that have been through the ESTA system, it will seem quite familiar. Other people will recognise it vaguely from the dreaded COVID era, when you're always having to get your app out to prove that you're COVID negative and all that kind of thing. That happened in a lot of airports and caused havoc. It was the usual thing. They had to prove that they had this on their app, but they couldn't find the app. They couldn't get the signal. During COVID times, it didn't really matter because there weren't many crowds travelling. But can you imagine this coming in to an airport that's already under pressure, like, for example, this summer or next summer? You can see the potential there for hiccups. So all we can do really as passengers is think ahead, get our heads around it. And I'm fully aware that for a lot of people with this podcast will be the first time that they're hearing about the whole thing. There's not been much publicity.
No, not at all. And it's definitely worth having on the radar, isn't it? Now, Dan, some of these changes have already happened, haven't they? So what has happened so far? And just tell us what has been some of the response from passengers.
So Chris touched on that a little bit just now, and you also did with regards to the ESTAS. Now that brings us to the system that the Home Office has brought in as of January 8th, which essentially means holidaying in the UK has changed for pretty much everyone who is not an EU citizen. So as you said, with the ESTAS, it's this ETA, or Electronic Travel Authorization documentation, is a mandatory prepaid travel document that affects some 6 million so people just now. And the requirement is for all non-EU Europeans entering the UK without UK residence or a visa to have one of these. And that includes for tourism reasons, business reasons, and it affects you from literally the moment you step foot on the UK to 6 months. So even if you are just getting a connecting flight, you've stopped at Heathrow per chance, you need to have this documentation before you can travel on to your next point of call. And yeah, the system has already caught some people out, including some travellers that we spoke to in Perth, Australia, who, to say the least, were a little bit annoyed that this documentation wasn't with them and they didn't know about it before they caught their flight.
I asked my daughter and the agency who do the tour for us. He said, we don't need before. She said, but it's open today, so I don't know what to do.
I was a bit surprised that you had to do it. I don't think it's been well advertised, really. I think there will be a lot of people who turn up without it.
Well, look, there you have it.
Yeah.
There's the nub of the problem, because this is the ETA system for people coming in to be tourists in the UK or business travellers. Big markets, remember, like Australia that we saw there, also the USA, for example. So lots and lots of people. Now, those people that we interviewed didn't know about it. So you can imagine the potential for chaos later in the summer, in the peak months, and you can imagine if that kind of thing also happens with the new system of the permits that we need to go into Europe at some stage. People need to get their heads around it. Where's the publicity? You know, why aren't people shouting about it? Why aren't there adverts? Why posters? Why are people hearing about it for the first time when they're at the airport about to flying to Heathrow?
Oh, absolutely. So Chris, you've also been getting reaction from other people here, notably the hospitality sector.
Yeah.
And the impacts on tourism here with this extra paperwork, well, digital stuff. I mean...
Yeah. Can you imagine how worried they are? Incoming tourists to this country worth £30 billion a year. We're meant to be going for growth. We're meant to be building that after all the chaos of pandemic where we saw tourism everywhere go down, including people coming to this country. Now, just as we're getting those numbers of inward tourists building again, we got this ETA scheme where there's a bit of friction, there's a bit of bureaucracy. I mean, it's not expensive, a tenner, but that's not the point. The point is it's just an extra worry for people. And when I spoke to Kate Nichols, who is the spokesperson for the UK hospitality industry, I said, does this make the UK less hospitable? Here's what she said.
We're concerned that lots of tourists don't know that they need it, so that while we're trying to show that we're welcome, we're open for business, we want to increase our inbound tourism numbers, such a vital export earner for the UK economy, that people will be deterred because they won't know that they've got to have this extra permission. We're concerned that people might be turned away at the border.
So we're hearing all about these concerns, aren't we? So Dan, is there a good basis for these fears we're hearing about? And is there a real concern and that there will be an impact on tourism here?
Yeah, I would say that those fears aren't unfounded, and they're certainly not something that's new. So this ETA system was actually originally introduced back in 2023 in November, and that originally encompassed the Gulf states. And Heathrow blamed the scheme for a 90,000 people drop in transfer passenger numbers on routes included within the scheme from that November 23 launch date. And that was just 7 countries that were affected by this ETA. Now it's being rolled out across the world, albeit incrementally, so as we touched on before, people who are out of the EU now have to have an ETA to come in. But as of April 2nd, if you're in the EU, you are also going to have to need this to holiday, to business here, with any period between now and 6 months.
So you can see why the tourism industry is so worried. All that trade they're trying to get from EU citizens to come and spend their summer holidays with us jeopardised by this extra level of bureaucracy. And for people around the world, one of the complexities is that this applies even if you're a transit passenger. So say you're flying into somewhere like Heathrow, only to fly immediately out again, that you're using it as a hub, you're still going to have to pay. There's still that bureaucracy. So there's a lot of anger. I'd say dismay. Heathrow themselves haven't given us a figure, but it has been reported that they expect that this could cost them at least £2.5 billion. Wow. In people just going, let's not use
just not
Heathrow
bother.
As the hub.
Go
we'll
via
go via
Amsterdam
Frankfurt, we'll go through Amsterdam, exactly. It's competition. So it is a concern for the industry.
So, Chris, you mentioned that the publicity around this has been pretty much zilch.
Have you seen any?
No, no, I haven't.
We should be getting paid for this podcast.
So what will we see next, do you think, as this switch to these electronic travel documents does roll out globally? Do you think we will get a little bit more awareness starting to drip through?
I hope so. I don't know whether what I'm about to say will survive the podcast editing process, but one of the travel agents I spoke to said, people have got to realise they've got to get their ETIAS into gear, which is right, because this ETIAS thing is going to start at some stage, probably the back half of 2025. So we're going to need people to be informed. People like travel agents, tour operators will do, hotel, all kinds of people will be responsible for getting the information out, but there's a lot of information to get out. What I'd say to anybody that's listening to us now is stay tuned. Look out for updates. We will be updating our website, just to plug that, a natural thing to do on a podcast.
Of course.
But also ABTA, the Association of British Travel Agents, have got really good information. The EU on their website have got really good information. And once it comes in, there are all kinds of pitfalls, You know, you've got to apply in good time. It can be processed very, very quickly, but it could take up to 30 days, although children go free and people over 70 go free. They've still got to go through the process. There are lots of little bumps in the road, little nuances there. But be under no doubt, this is coming thick and fast, not just to Europe, all around the world, because we've got now this fusion of the app and digital technology with security needs and efficiency needs just coalescing. I spoke to somebody who is really high up in border security in Europe who said there is no doubt in his mind that by 2030, forget your paper passports, not only paper passports last century, they're probably the century before that, will all be digital. And I've actually got a list here. So we've got the EU and the UK going down this route where you'll need some digital permits, not to replace passports at this stage, but you will need the permits. Thailand also this year, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, all looking at this right now. And it makes sense. If you look at the EU alone, 600 million crossings of their borders every year. At the moment, all that paperwork and all that. If it can be digitised, lots and lots of advantages. We spoke to the UK Home Office saying, what do you think about concerns about this, about the friction to trade and perhaps putting people off? They said, look, it's going to improve efficiency long term and security. Who can stand against that kind of progress? So I'm afraid it's going to be one of those things, I think, where we travellers, for the greater good, are going to have to swallow a bit of fiddle factor.
OK, we'll have to get used to that, suck that one up. Chris and Dan, thank you both so much for alerting us to this, talking through it as well. Well, don't forget, you can watch Chris's full report and read more on this story right over on our website and also on ITVX. And do continue to have a listen to our latest quick briefings to find out what you need to know about a range of headline topics. Until next time, thank you for listening.